as Mr. Stromberg said, I am the fifth generation I am the fifth generation descendant to work for Minard Run Oil Company, which was started in 1875 by my great-great-grandfather, Lewis Emery Jr. And his story begins in a village. He was born August 10th, 1839, near the village of Cherry Creek in Chautauqua County, New York. He was the youngest of 7 children born to Lewis Emery Sr., and his wife was Maria Gilson Emery. In 1840, Lewis Emery Sr. contracted with the Erie Railroad to build a railway near Olean, New York, which became the New York, Lake Erie, and Western Railroad. By 1841, Emery Sr. had built 2 miles of the Genesee Valley Canal. Due to non-payment from the railroad, Emery Sr. severed his ties. Building railroads was not his only trade. He was a thorough mechanic and very adept in the very details of the woolen manufacturing of cloth making. Having this background, Emery Sr. decided to move his family west and their livestock. The journey actually stopped in Jonesville, Hillsdale County, Michigan. They were actually destined for Wisconsin because of the loss of their livestock. They ended up stopping in Jonesville, Michigan. Those folks there, learning of Emery Sr.'s mechanical and woolen trade background, the people of Jonesville and the surrounding countryside persuaded Emery Sr. To stay. They actually built him a mill, and paying them back, he paid them back with the profits of his sales. They stayed in Jonesville, Michigan for about 7 years. In 1848, Emery Sr. built a second mill, and he had bought a large farm near the county seat of Hillsdale, Michigan. In 1849, Emery Sr. moved his family to Hillsdale to reside. In 1864, Emery Sr. sold the mill and his farm and settled in Hillsdale, Michigan, where he later died August 21st of 1886. Lewis Emery Jr. was only 2 years old when they moved to Hillsdale, Michigan. Lewis Emery Jr. attended country schools until he was 9 years old, at which point his father, Emery Sr., had built a second factory and bought a large farm near Hillsdale, which I said earlier, to which Emery Jr. stayed until 1864. So he basically, Emery Jr. basically followed his father's footsteps and learned what his father did to survive. So he learned all the mechanics of, working on farm equipment, building these mills and learning the woolen trade. Before the move to Michigan, Emery Jr. would accompany his father on his travels, not only learning the trades of his father, but also his father's hard work and accomplishments. By traveling with his father, this gave Emery Jr. his father's enterprise and initiative. And just a side note, when Emery Jr. and his sibling were young, they actually became owners of a flour mill, and they had considerable success with that, which was kind of neat. They took upon themselves to start a flour mill, and I thought that was pretty ingenious back in the day, only if our young people would do that now. Emery Jr. went on to attend Hillsdale College in Michigan, and that is where he met and later married his wife, Elizabeth A. Caldwell. At the age of 19, Emery taught school at the District of Wheatland Township in Michigan for 2 years, and after that 2-year period, he returned to his father's mill to resume working. And unfortunately, we don't have any pictures from Michigan. It's only here in the state of Pennsylvania. On December 29th, 1863, Lewis Emery Jr. and Elizabeth A. Caldwell married at her home in Vistula, Elkhart County, Indiana. And of that marriage, the following children were born to Lewis Emery Jr. and Elizabeth Caldwell Emery. Clara Louise Emery was born July 20th, 1865, but unfortunately she passed away in 1866. Delavan Emery, which is my grandmother's father, was born September 26, 1867, and he passed in August of 1911. And coincidentally, today is September 15th, which would be my Grandma Fesenmeyer's birthday. I don't know how old she would be, but I do know today is her birthday, so happy birthday. Grace Elizabeth Emery was born January 27th. Earl Caldwell Emery was born December 12th of 1875, and then there was a Lewis Emery III, born August 27th in 1878. Lewis Emery Jr. continued to work at his father's mill until 1864, but it was then that Emery left Michigan to seek work in Edgewood, Illinois. There, Emery Jr. built a mill and was involved in general merchandising. In August 1865, as the war was coming to a close and business was coming to a standstill, Emery Jr. left Illinois to seek other fields of interest. He started east for the oil fields of Pennsylvania. He first stopped in Pit Hole, Venango County, Pennsylvania, 8 miles east of Oil City. Having only arrived with his span of faithful horses, he established a teamster business, because at that time the bulk of the oil production made was drawn by horse teams, giving my grandfather a tremendous profit with those teams of horses. And Emery Jr. remarked on more than one occasion, quote, "The old team served me in good stead." It was in Pit Hole, Venango County, Pennsylvania, that Emery saw the first successful crude pipeline in operation. It was invented and operated by Samuel Van Sickle. The pipeline covered a distance of 6 miles and connected the Miller farm with a refinery in Pit Hole. Emery knew Van Sickle well and watched with great interest the delivery of oil through this pipeline. He then realized at that point that his form of transportation, or this form of transportation, would not only replace the horse-drawn transportation, it would be the cheapest, quickest, and most efficient means. Transporting oil by pipeline was only $1 per barrel. So Emery learned yet another trade. With the rise in oil production and transporting, Emery was able to hire a relief driver for his teamsters. This freed him from constant travel and gave him extra time to work as a tool dresser on a well near Pioneer Run, Pennsylvania. With his knowledge of machinery, he set a slipped eccentric, a displaced valve, and expanded or caulked boiler flues. Not only was he making money in the teamster business, he was making money as a tool dresser as well. So he was a potpourri individual, kind of did a little bit of everything. While at Pioneer Run, Emery Jr. located his first well, sharing in the ups and downs of the producers during that time. Emery displayed a remarkable capacity for research and acquired an extensive practical knowledge along the lines of this new industry. He attempted a second well with his partner, James McElney. When that well became coming in, McElney summoned Emery for help, but unfortunately he was in bed suffering from overexhaustion. The doctors had ordered him to stay into bed, but he got out of bed and was determined to get to that well, and he was watching the oil pour down the side of a hill about 400 barrels per day, ruining both flowing and uncompleted wells below it. It was then he grabbed a shovel and actually started saying to his men, "Come on, boys, life and property are in danger." Emery later reported that, quote, "We managed to keep the oil from the valley by connecting the well to a large water tank. and saved the entire Pioneer Run from ruin. We also saved the oil, which was then bearing a price of $4 a barrel, end quote. Emery's transformation from teamster and producer to refiner took place in 1868. In 1870, Emery Jr. traveled to Titusville, Pennsylvania, Crawford County. It was there that Emery began his way to wealth and rapidly rose to the top rank among well-known producers. With his determination and enterprise, coupled with a strong sense of honor in all his business dealings, he commanded the respect and confidence of the whole community. And then at that point, unfortunately, there was a bank back in this time, the J. Cook and Company of New York, and it was a huge failure of this bank. And so Emery was left with obligations that he could not be protected in time, and sent him basically to the wall, as they quote, hopelessly ruined. But he persevered, and having the characteristic and enterprise and confidence in himself, he looked for ways to regain his lost fortunes. So by that time, he had heard of stories about McKean County. So in 1875, he had heard that McKean County had always been, McKean County had been of interest to him. He had always suspected that the hills held beneath them a vast lake of petroleum waiting to be tapped into. He wanted to test his ideas with a drill, so he relocated to McKean County. Arriving with his dignity and confidence intact, he leased and purchased about 14,000 acres of timberland without $1 of capital, just the confidence that the citizens of McKean County entrusted in him. His legacy began July 28, 1875, on what was known as the Tibbetts Farm. He drilled his first well, which was called Emery No. 1 at Toad Hollow. As many of you know who have lived here a while and know the ins and outs of Bradford, that location is actually known as Songbird Road now. It's the South Avenue side of Songbird Road, because there used to be the Niles Hollow, or the West Gordon side, and this is on the Songbird side, the South Avenue side. That well began flowing in October of 1875. So when we drill wells today, it's a magnificent thing to watch them put a drill in the ground. You have to they basically can drill a well in 3 days, and then the production comes in, whereas it took July to October, 3 months, 4 months before they saw any production. Yielding approximately 40 barrels per day, this proved to be a large fortune for Emery Jr., wiping out his debt that he had brought with him, and also the residents of McKean, and proving to be one of the greatest oil fields in the world. This opened up for Emery not only wealth, but also territory that he accumulated. Over 500 wells were pouring into Emery's storehouse. In the Bradford era, wrote, Lewis Emery Jr. is credited with striking oil in 1875 and starting the oil boom in the Bradford area. The land that he purchased at 6 1/4 cents per acre immediately skyrocketed to $1,000 per acre. So in 1875, $1,000 an acre, that's quite a pretty penny. What's that?
So that's about what you pay now.
Right. He continued to purchase surrounding leases and properties in the Bradford field, which added to his wealth and success. He actually purchased land next to the Buffalo, Rochester, and Pittsburgh and Erie rail lines. It was on that land that Emery Manufacturing Company was built. And I will try to show you. This is a picture of Emery Refinery on Mill Street, because that's actually where it was built. And it's an aerial image. So if you go down Mill Street, right after Dr. Smith's, it's right in that area where this was built. Yes, ma'am, sir.
There's, the switch on the Buffalo and Pittsburgh Railroad is still marked Emery siding down there.
No kidding.
For the-
Oh, really?
Yep, and there's a little white sign on the switch. If you go down Mill Street and look, you can see it right on there.
No kidding.
Yep.
I'll be darned. Whoops. This is the postcard picture of the refinery. I don't know if y'all would be able to see it. Oh, I switched it again. Hold it. I don't know if y'all can see that, but
Can't see it.
no. So Emery purchased that land next to, at peak production, the Emery Manufacturing Company, the Emery Manufacturing Company refined 50,000 barrels of oil per month and had a tank capacity of 100,000 barrels. Let's try that. If you drive by American Refining Group today, the Mill Street part of the refinery is where Emery Refinery was built. It was the purchase of the quintuple tract in 1876 that paid the most dividends to him. He held on to a quarter interest of the tract. He sold 4,020 acres to the Producers Consolidated Land and Petroleum Company for $125 an acre, which, adding to his own production, that's how he became a millionaire. As with any research that anybody does, sometimes there is a villain, sometimes they're not. This villain happens to be Rockefeller from Standard Oil Company. And he even got a building in his name, Rockefeller Center. But anyway, he was obviously the founder, chairman, and major stockholder of Standard Oil Company. And he had refineries in Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia. And it was during that time that Standard Oil Company was monopolizing the transportation of the infamous quote-unquote black gold. Unfortunately, he began buying up pipelines, controlling the railroads, transporting agents, and terminal facilities to force the independents to sell their oil at below market price, forcing them into bankruptcy. Strength was found in numbers, and knowing all too well about monopolies, Emery knew that by convincing other independents they could tackle this monstrosity, kind of like what our industry is doing today to fight all these regulations that are trying to be passed, that they want to, they want to do away with the oil and gas industry. So I guess if you're in the oil and gas industry, Rockefeller was his monstrosity. Our monstrosity today is EDP, EPA. I mean, you pick one out of the hat, and they just don't want to deal with us. But anyway, in 1868, Emery founded the Bradford Oil Exchange of the Northwestern Pennsylvania Oil Producers Association, and determined to keep their independence, and along with Emery's intelligence and immense courage, they took the fight to Rockefeller. Legal action ensued, trying to break the chains that held the independents captive and at the mercy of the Standard Oil Company. Unfortunately, Standard could afford to supply money to their lawyers and to bury the independents in paperwork, tying the case up for years. I'm going to segue a minute. In 1878, McKean County was entitled to one representative in the lower house of the Pennsylvania legislature. While championing the interests of the oil district, Emery was chosen and elected to represent McKean County in the General Assembly. Emery had knowledge, strength, and courage to begin a rigorous battle that continued through the years in the lower house and then in the state senate. In 1880, the people of McKean County returned him to legislature with credentials of a senator. He started a movement in a changed direction, transcending in importance many other movements and setting in motion certain trends that continue today. The Sherman antitrust law, the interstate commerce and trade legislation, along with similar enactments, are traceable to the unrest existing at the time in the oil country, and more specifically to the strong personality of Senator Emery. And I do have a small story to tell about my grandfather. He actually got into a brawl on the Senate floor. My father actually just told me this story. So they were on the Senate floor, and there were other senators there. I mean, obviously he was for the oil and gas industry. There was another senator there. I guess you could call him an agricultural senator because he was trying to pass legislation for like the milk industry. So my father said that, you know, Grandpa Emery approached this other senator and said, you know, I'll support what you want to bring as legislation if you support what I want to bring as legislation. You know, I'll do for you if you do for me. And the senator agreed. He said, absolutely, I'll vote for your legislation. That's not a problem. So they go through. Well, that particular senator did not vote for what my grandfather was trying to impose for legislation. So that obviously upset my grandfather very much. So when everything was said and done, he met him on the floor, and my grandfather said, well, you didn't help me out. And this milk senator said, well, you calling me a liar? And before my grandfather could answer, that senator hauled off and punched my grandfather. So my grandfather returned the punch, and in the Bradford era, and I thought I had it written in here, but he actually, the Bradford era said that he was the only senator that punched another senator and left him in a pool of blood on the Senate floor. If only that could happen again today, but I won't. I guess I better watch what I say. So, anyway, back to Rockefeller. So while the producers of the Western state were battling for freedom, Emery planned a double pipeline from Bradford, PA to a connection with the Reading Railroad at Williamsport, PA. The Reading management would not guarantee Emery that they would receive the oil and carry it to the seaboard. But Emery then decided to begin a route from Bradford, ending with a junction with the New York, Ontario, and Western Railroad in Hancock, New York. Going over the rails of that road to the Hudson River at Cornwall, then by water using barges to the New York Harbor. The New York, Ontario, and Western Railroad welcomed this proposal. Emery, knowing that the pipeline must cross the Erie at Hancock, he approached the president of the road. The president said, yeah, go ahead. We wish to encourage all new means of transportation. Rockefeller, having gotten wind of that proposal, tried to stop it by putting pressure on management of the Erie Railroad, forcing them to back away from their agreement with Senator Emery. Crews from the pipeline were met at the tracks by members of the railroad, ceasing the build of that pipeline. So being a man of courage and knowledge, he came up with a plan. While keeping his crews in Hancock to distract Rockefeller, Emery secured another right-of-way from further back on the original line. He branched out a new line to Wilkes-Barre. There he made a contract with the New Jersey Central Railroad. On September 20th, 1892, the United States Pipeline Company was incorporated under Pennsylvania law with a capital of $600,000 and Emery as its first president. Emery blueprinted plans for not one, but two pipelines to the coast. One for running refined oil, the other for untouched crude. These lines would run from Bradford, connecting in Hancock, New York, and from there he hoped the New York, Ontario, and Western Railroad would complete the link to the Hudson. Ground was broke a mile outside of Bradford on his Kendall Avenue property, and it's my understanding that that is near Main Street, or it stopped at Main Street, I think. Don't quote me on that. With the passage of the Freed Pipeline Bill, Emery decided to lay the pipeline along the Erie track. when Emery's crew reached Erie Switchyard in downtown Bradford, I'm sorry, that's what I was referring to, down by Main Street, they were met by 2 to 3 men, or 2 to 3 hand cars filled with Rockefeller's men, and they jumped off their hand cars and they tried pulling Emery's men off of the line. And then they began taking, what they had done is they had taken hot water from their train and brought it with them on the hand car, and they basically took that hot water and sprayed Emery's men. So, having dealt with the monstrosity of the Standard Oil Company, Emery knew just how to outwit them with their tactics. Having seen his men squirted with boiling water, he returned with force. He ordered his men to bring the pot boiler Emery donated to the Bradford Fire Department to the construction site. When the railmen persisted in their attack, Emery's crew were ready to give them a dose of their own medicine, forcing the men recruited by Standard on the hand cars off the tracks. Emery and his crew picked up where they left off, laying the line just where Emery had designed it. So he basically, if you go out to the oil museum, there is the potbelly fire engine is on display out there. In June 24th of 1893, the United States Pipeline made its first run of refined oil from Titusville to Wilkes-Barre, where it was taken on tank cars and then shipped to the seaboard. Continuing to grow, it acquired the Producers Oil Company and the Producers and Refiners Pipeline in the process. Running parallel to its original line, it could boast of being able to pipe out raw crude while at the same time bring back refined oil. It was the most successful pipeline ever operated in competition with Standard Oil's lines. Senator Emery always fought for his beliefs and defended the interests of his constituents, opposing monopolies in any form. He is still known as the only legislator to get in a physical brawl on the Senate floor. In addition to exploring and producing oil, Emery owned the Bradford Hardware Lumber Company, the Fairbanks Wood Run Company. He started Emery Oil, which is now Minard Run Oil, and that was incorporated in 1906. He also started the American Alkali and Acid Company, which played an important part in World War I, supplying vital chemicals in our war against Germany, which though it was mustard gas, and they actually made it down behind where Minard Run Oil is today. The part of the foundation is still there, where they actually made it. So I thank you very much for your time. I will try to answer your questions. All of my research has been done by reading previous research that was done by Willard M. Klein, and I don't know if is that your husband, Joyce, or was that his boy?
Oh, no. Oh.
Well, in any event, I have to give credit to Willard M. Klein because he wrote a very nice article on Lewis Emery. It was actually for school. It was a school
Willard
project.
L. That was Willard L. Because I still have a copy of that.
Okay.
I typed it up for him.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. So, I mean, again, this research comes from what I have discovered. Another, which I did not know, here's for governor, Lewis Emery for governor. And I'm actually, this evening, one of my aunts, specifically my Aunt Natalie, she gave me these earrings that were given to Lewis Emery's wife, Elizabeth. And on the back it says Lewis Emery Jr. And then on the front it's the crest, the Pennsylvania crest.
Who was Grace Emery?
Oh, that's right. I got to fill in those spaces, don't I? So Delavan Emery was one of the sons of Lewis Emery Jr. And he married, and they only had one child. Excuse me, you asked who Grace Emery was.
Yes.
Grace Emery was a daughter to Lewis Emery Jr. So she's the one that actually built the hotel to honor her father, Louis Emery. Now, Delavan was Grace's brother. Delavan Emery married and had my grandma Fesenmeyer. So when they started running the company, it's my understanding that over the years, after he passed, Earl Emery ran it for years. Louis Emery III, I believe, was a pianist, a very, very talented pianist, and he moved to New York City. But Earl Emery took over. When my grandmother, Elizabeth Emery, she actually, so her father died and her mother married a Kennedy. And I believe this Kennedy was in the timbering. I can't remember if it was the oil industry or the timbering industry. So then she became Elizabeth Emery Kennedy. Then when she met my grandfather, who was Francis Wayne Fesenmeyer, she was Elizabeth Emery Fesenmeyer. So she basically had the majority of all these control of Minard Run Oil, which she did not want to run the day-to-day, so she asked my grandfather, my Grandpa Wayne Fesenmeyer, to run the company. And also, he had another company in Michigan, and it was called Lobdell Emery, which actually got bought out in 1998. But that company actually made parts for Ford and GM. So he basically he would fly from Michigan to here, and he was running both operations. And then, of course, my grandfather took over after he passed when he married my grandmother. And then in February of 1976, my grandfather Wayne passed away. At that point, it was my grandmother that, because my uncle Ken Fesenmeyer was running the company in Michigan. And so she called my father and said, you need to come home, you need to, help run this company here in Bradford. Dad's story is always that we were in Colorado and he said, oh, I'm just gonna go home and, help tidy things up and then I'll go back to Colorado. Well, 40 years later, he's still here, which is very, very good. But, so he ran the company, and then in 2017 he said, okay, here you go, it's your turn, which is a great honor. I'm very, very proud to work for Minard Run Oil Company and for a person, a gentleman of his. Grandpa Emery is really I don't know what else to say, I'm losing my words. He was very intuitive and just a great man. So again, if you guys have any questions, I'll try to do the best I can.
You have an Uncle Delavan too, don't you?
Yes, that was Delavan Kennedy Fesenmeyer, and that was my uncle. So it goes, so my grandmother had 4 kids, which would be Delavan, Ken, Emery Fesenmeyer, Natalie Emery Fesenmeyer, and then my father, Frederick Wayne, and then their youngest sister, Elaine Northrop Fesenmeyer. Mm-hmm.
Is there a connection, doesn't Daniel Kingsbury figure into the Emery family if you go way back? I might be wrong about that, maybe Sally Costa.
Kingsbury, is that what you said?
Yes.
I'm not aware of the connection, but I know that now out at Pitt, there were 2 Emerys. There was Louis Emery, but then there was also another Emery who I believe built the hangar out at Pitt. That's a different family.
I know the Emery mansion on Congress Street was connected to Daniel Kingsbury's house at one time. So
That mansion was my great-grandfather's
Right,
house.
So,
Yeah, he bought Kingsbury's mansion, tore down most of it when he built his. He
oh,
built
there was
that
no
big-
family relation?
There's no family
Oh,
relation, and
That-
as for
I
the
was
other
confused
Emery,
about the house.
I live in that house,
Yes, yes,
And
you
he's
do.
the airport Emery.
Yes.
And I tell people all the time, there's no connection unless, way, way back
Right,
in
right.
generations. It really, I always say, my Emery was a rich Emery, but Lewis Emery was fabulously wealthy Emery.
And he worked hard for everything, as all of our, if you're in the oil industry, your descendants worked very, very hard, and I can only thank them for, allowing us to continue that legacy. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of I'm not gonna get on the bandwagon of politics, but these big people that wanna pass legislation, they don't take into consideration the long-standing history here in Pennsylvania. I mean, they don't, and it's unfortunate. So,
So how old is the Minard Run Oil Company again?
we are 146 years old this year.
And you're sole producers of crude oil or?
Yeah, we are, well, if I'm correct in this, we are the world's oldest independent, still running under the same management, family-owned company in the world.
Wow.
And again, I'm the 5th generation, so.
how many
I mean, if
trucks?
somebody does the research and says, you're not, then I'll definitely take that in and mark that in my notes, but.
You have gas, don't you? Gas too? Don't you have
Yes.
gas?
Yes, we do produce, or yes, we extract gas also. Well, when we drill our wells, there's gas that comes out of it naturally, because that's what brings the,
Natural gas.
right.
We have a question over here.
Oh, yep,
Not a question, just an observation. There's a book called The Titan
yes,
about Rockefeller, and there's a whole chapter that's dedicated to the fight between he and your great-grandfather. So
Yes.
that's how significant that was.
yeah,
So,
yeah, and like I said, they passed a law regarding it. What'd you have?
Meredith, you said something of one of Lewis Emery's companies was a Fairbanks something or other, and I didn't catch what you said that was.
It was the Bradford Hardwood Lumber Company and Fairbanks Wood Run Company.
Wood Run.
Wood brim,
Yeah.
wood brim.
Oh, it's Rim?
They made wooden wheels for
Oh, okay.
cars.
Okay.
Oh, okay,
Wood brim.
okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Al.
Yes, thank you very much.
Any other questions?
In Michigan, actually, my brother Chris, he lives in Michigan, and there's actually a sign. They have maybe not. There was a sign put up that says Lewis Emery Community Park in Hillsdale, Michigan, and then there's also, they have like a makeshift fireplace at the park that says Lewis Emery in Michigan. My brother took a picture of that, but I can't show you, so. Yes, sir?
So you had said that it's 147 years of drilling and producing oil?
Yeah.
Yes, 146 years.
How deep is that well?
Oh, we don't know the statistics on the very first well. I've even asked my dad, is there any marker to show us where that well is at? And he said, unfortunately, he even tried, when he was back in the day, tried to find that actual well on the hillside, and they were unable to find it. Anybody else?
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you very much.